season being a man, you're dealing with representations of masculinity in Hollywood, and your comments on it suggest that what you're really trying to do is to look at a face which, if not quite hidden, is at least the other side of the coin from the one that we're more familiar with. And in doing that, it seems to me that there always can be the problem that I hinted at just now, and perhaps in approaching this and looking at figures which don't simply put forward the normal sort of macho vision, it can be said that gay people especially might be more perceptive about this thing, certainly that they've less to lose than heterosexual men who may want to indulge these more popular images. At the same time, there are lots of gay men who are so determined to sort of prove the other side of the coin that they will read things in. So whereas it may be that your perceptions are in fact heightened in a very positive way, other people might say, no, you're reading in too much. So what is your response to that?
Well, I think I always like to make a distinction between reading things in and bringing things out. I mean, I think there's always been a very great problem in reading, particularly popular movies, in sort of simply accepting them in the terms in which they seem to present themselves, just as entertainments. I think one has to sort of, in the first place, break down that kind of approach to popular films, and to read them as being about things, as being both entertainments and representations of attitudes and values. And I've always been particularly interested in the potential for popular culture to criticize the dominant value system. And I think that happens a good deal more often than we tend to think, or I think did.
Right. Can I challenge you on one film specifically in that connection, because this will clarify the sort of issues really I'm getting at. I haven't, I must confess, actually seen the American version of Gaslight. I've seen the British version, and one knows of it as a well-known play. And on the face of it, one would say here that you have a plot about a man who has in fact married somebody for her money. It turns out later that he's already committed another crime earlier, an old woman who's died. But approaching it in the context of being as a man, you immediately suggest that the real way of looking at this is that he is a man who is frightened of female sexuality. And this is the sort of thing I have in mind that I would slightly say, is it not the case that without reading that into it, the thing is complete in itself, or could be, so why do you feel that that has to be an extra factor? Or are there certain scenes in the film, indeed, that you would put forward as evidence that it's wrong to exclude that from the film?
Oh, indeed. Well, I think, Gaslight is part of a whole cycle of movies which appear in, well, they start with Rebecca and go through throughout the 40s, about married women being persecuted by their husbands. And all those films, it seems to me, are very explicitly criticisms of marriage, and in particular, they're criticisms of a culture which encourages women to go into marriage with certain expectations of what it will be. Which contradict the expectations with which men go into marriage, and I think Gaslight is the film of that group, which is most explicitly about a man who has a neurotic dread of women and is driven by a desire to establish his power over them. I think all the film's imagery bears that out. For example, there's an image in the film of the first woman he murdered years ago, Ingrid Bergman's aunt, who was an opera singer. And the only actual image we get of her in the film is in one of her great roles on the stage as the Empress Theodora, which is precisely an image of female power and authority. And the jewels which the Boyer character wishes to steal have been concealed in the costume which she wore as the Empress Theodora. So there's a quite direct connection between the idea of stealing the woman's property and disempowering her. And I think the whole meaning of the film turns on that connection. I mean, he wants to get the money at a quite basic level, but it's not a practical need. He himself says at the end of the film, when he's been caught, I don't know why I want the money, I don't know why I did it. So his behaviour simply can't be explained in those practical terms, and I think the film emphasises that. So one is encouraged to ask, well, if it can't be explained in that way, how can it be explained?
It's a long time since I saw the Thor Dickinson version. I can't remember if there's a comparable scene in that, because I was wondering if these elements that you find in Cukor's film actually go back to the Patrick Hamilton original play and therefore also the British film, or whether this is something that's brought in the Hollywood version as something new.
I think it's brought in the Hollywood version. Because the whole first half hour of the film isn't in the play at all. It's something which Cukor has added. The play begins with the arrival of the Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer characters in the house. Cukor gives us this kind of very elaborate exposition where the courtship takes place, where the two characters are established. And they're established in terms of two quite different sets of fantasies. The Ingrid Bergman character approaching marriage as basically the solution to all her emotional problems, the fears and anxieties which she's inherited from the past and which she thinks her husband will conquer for her. And Boyer approaching the marriage in a quite different set of terms, which the Bergman character knows nothing about, in terms of reenacting in the present the kind of the relationship which he's already had in the past with the Bergman character's aunt. And all that I think is crucial. I mean, it's not in the play at all. And I think it's introduced by Cukor's quite specific and recurrent set of interests in gender and gender oppression.
Yes, I was wondering again whether you felt that this was all clearly there in the script, or whether Cukor as director brings out something or even puts something into the script, so to speak.
Well, I think it seems to be the case that all the great American directors either actually collaborated on their scripts or had a very strong input into them. And I think Cukor's work is very consistent in this respect. I mean, it's not simply in Gaslight. If one goes to other films too, one notes this repeated concern with the oppression of women by traditional norms of masculinity, and also a kind of a quite very powerful commitment to the women in their struggle against those oppressions.
I think this one is actually fairly early in the season, isn't it? So it may be that it'll be a bit earlier than the piece appears in What's On. So let me ask you in a rather similar way, because this may be a better piece to use for the What's On article at least.
Yes.
Approach it in the same way that the film of Chaplin, City Lights.
Yes.
Where apart from the comic elements that one associates with Chaplin, I think that one would tend to sort of see this as a rather sentimental love story with the blind heroine and so on. And that again is something which many people would sort of see as the essence of the film, either responding positively to it or more critically, in fact.
Yes.
But your stress again here is on, quoting your own phrase, I think the femininity of male desire. And again, I have this sort of same reaction, that would anybody who made the film or saw it at that time really be conscious of any comment on that being made, or is this a 1990s attitude? And in this case, do you feel, from your point of view, that the film did actually set out to say something about that, or that it reveals something about it without necessarily meaning to?
Well, I think this is obviously a very difficult area. I think it highly unlikely that if one had asked Chaplin whether he had conceived in the film in those terms, he would have said yes. And I think it's probably highly unlikely that any contemporary audience watching the film would have understood their experience of the film in those terms. I don't think that is really relevant. I think it's quite possible for an artist to make a film which expresses things very systematically, which he himself could not articulate, or where the artist is thinking about the material in a different way from the way in which a critic would think about it. Now, I don't think that invalidates the critic's commentary. All it means is that the artist has been using a different set of terms when thinking about the material. No, I would agree that I think I very much doubt if Chaplin thought directly about the kind of gender issues that are at stake in City Lights or in any of his films. But I don't think that means that they're not there.
No, since this is one, as I say, that in terms of the timing may well fit for the What's On article rather well, could I ask you to elaborate on your view of City Lights as to how these issues, which Chaplin maybe subconsciously was allowing through, actually take your eye? What are the elements in it that make you feel this is the right way to describe this film?
Well, it's a film about romantic love, and the kind of two central characters are the tramp and another destitute woman who is blind. What I think interests Chaplin in the film is the experience of falling in love from the male point of view, the kind of emotions that generates, and the kind of needs that it generates. And I think that what is continually emphasized is the tramp's feminization. I think femininity is a crucial element of the tramp persona anyway, and it's brought out in the film in various ways. For example, there's that wonderful boxing fight, which is more or less a kind of continuous series of gay gags about a Chaplin being faced with the task of fighting an extremely aggressive macho man, and responding to that really through a kind of parody of masculinity to sort of protect himself. So I think it's not simply at the level of the love story, but in the kind of the level of comedy as well. I think this is one of the things that makes Chaplin such an interesting figure. We're very used to comedians who use male femininity as a kind of butt for extremely negative humour. I think one of the things that Chaplin does is to use it as a means of generating extremely positive humour. for criticising dominant images of maleness, and for incorporating femininity very affirmatively in his own persona.
Right, so that is fine. Let me just take one more on this same level, and then I won't keep on with this exact approach. We'll move on to some other areas.
Yeah.
But just to take one other example, because it's more modern, and therefore you could certainly argue that the elements would be more consciously handled, and censorship would allow more. I'm thinking of Raging Bull, in fact, which I think is a great film.
Yes.
Here you have Robert De Niro playing a character who has come out of poverty and with a sort of lack of education, and who as a boxer can prove himself in the ring, and it seems to be a quest really for power and for assertion to compensate for what life has initially denied him.
Yeah.
And again, I would be inclined to feel that on the surface at least is enough to motivate that particular story, whereas your reaction to that again is to refer to it as a denial of homoerotic desire. I mean, it interests me that to move to a film that isn't in your season for a second, because it's not a Hollywood film, but when I saw The Craze recently, which I found a very interesting film, I don't know if you've seen it.
Yes, I haven't seen it yet.
There is a very strong boxing scene there between the two brothers, which reminded me of Raging Bull in the way that it was shot, and also seems to me a very clear statement of it being a denial of homoerotic desire between the brothers.
Yes.
And in that case, it seems to me the whole situation in the film backs up that particular viewpoint. I haven't seen Raging Bull since it first came out, but again, this seemed to me an extra level that was perhaps being imported. So could you just once more justify your...
Well, I mean, in fact, in this case, I mean, I have authority from the director's mouth.
Right.
Because shortly after the film came out, I and Robin Wood, in fact, presented this argument to Scorsese, that the film was really about repressed homoeroticism. And his response was very interesting. He said he hadn't realised it when he was making the film, but he agreed. So I think that is, I mean, it's a quite interesting comment about artistic intention, in fact.
He accepted this fairly readily.
Oh, yes.
From what you said, and I mean, did you have to back it up with justification by pointing to particular things in detail?
Oh, yes.
And perhaps you could say something about the elements that had struck you that led you and Robin Wood to that particular conclusion.
Well, emotionally, the most important thing about the De Niro character in the film is his obsessional jealousy of his wife. He continually suspects her of having sexual relationships with other men, and finally of having a sexual relationship with his brother. And what I think the film suggests is that that this kind of paranoid jealousy of the wife is a projection onto her of sexual desires for men that the De Niro character himself experiences.
Except I would have, of course, said that it could be another reflection of the insecurity that I was talking about from his early developments instead of this. So
I agree.
So can you go further to justify that?
Well, there's one key line, I think. There's one of the fights that LaMotta has is with a boxer who is exceptionally attractive physically. And before the fight, somebody actually brings this up in conversation with LaMotta, and he replies, "Yes, I don't know whether to fuck him or fight him." And I think it's the key line in the film. And he goes on in the next scene to kind of pummel this man into kind of pulp.
Right.
And I think the connection that's set up all the time is between the violence against men in the ring, which is always excessive. I mean that is continually stressed. Is defined as a means of denying physical attraction. He fights them because he can't fuck them. And that also feeds into the violence against his wife. He suspects her of doing what he in fact wants to do. It's very important, I think, that what finally drives him over the top is the suspicion that she's been having sex with his brother. And the kind of intimacy of the physical and emotional intimacy of their relationship is stressed right from the beginning of the film.
Right.
So I think that's the kind of connection that the film is concerned with.
Right. To move away to a more general comment on the season, I wondered if in some ways this is sort of quite the right forum, as you might almost say, for what you're doing, in that it seemed to me that if you're trying to say, look, there are all these alternative images which may not always have been recognized as such coming from Hollywood, that is in a sense a thesis, and to make a thesis you really have to have sort of continuity and carry the argument through, whereas a season like this at the NFT is one where even somebody who's particularly interested in the theme is not likely to get to all the films coming so close together as they are, and so many of them.
Yes.
So, do you see the limitations of that, and are you planning to develop the thesis in some other form? And will the program notes indeed at the NFT do anything to sort of carry forward the thesis if you're wanting to present one, or will they be standard ones with just reviews that came out at the time unrelated to your reason for presenting these particular films together?
No, I'm writing all the program notes for the screenings. And I'm also working on a monograph which the NFT is going to be publishing later in August, which will attempt to give an account of the central themes of the season.
Coming after the event there?
Well, I think it probably will, yes. But there's another season in September which is a follow-up to this about cross-dressing. We're hoping that the booklet will be out in the middle of that season.
Is this Richard Dyer's one, or is it in addition to that?
No, this is in addition to that.
He's got his season coming up, so there are in effect two seasons coming up with particular gay interest.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Well, that is perhaps sort of justifying it in a way. Perhaps it's a pity that it's not available earlier, but your own program notes at least will bring out what you want for the audiences to note.
Exactly.
Looking again at the program that you've got from the Hollywood films, two things occurred to me to ask you about in terms of any theories that you had on the points. One was that you mentioned yourself that these films with these sort of alternative images tend to go up to about 1980. And indeed you've only two films that are later than that, Tightrope and To Live and Die in LA.
Yeah.
So there's a suggestion that the 80s, for whatever reason, is less of a period for this kind of film to come out of Hollywood. And also, although you didn't mention the point in your introduction, whether by chance or not, the 60s is another period which is not represented except by man's favourite sport, which is the single exception. And although you can sort of lead up to sort of elements of Vietnam and so on, it is the whole decade that seems to be missing apart from that one film. So is this again an area that for some reason produced less of these kind of movies, and can you say why you think that if that's so, that the 60s and the 80s have been less fruitful than the other decades?
Well, I think the 80s is an easier question to answer. Right. I think one can detect from the late 70s onwards, from the aftermath of Vietnam, from the aftermath of Watergate, a kind of general movement towards a very extreme conservatism in the American cinema. And I think the crucial turning point is the appearance of Rocky and Star Wars. And since then, although I don't think the American cinema has been monolithically reactionary, I think it has certainly been more conservative than at any other previous period in its history. And I think one has to relate that to this kind of massive reaction in American politics and American culture, which has taken place since Vietnam. And also, I mean, that's the main thing, but also I think to kind of the economic changes that have been taking place in the industry too. That given the way in which American movies are now financed, it's becoming increasingly difficult for any challenging work to get past the production stage.
What about the 60s, which you say is a harder one to answer? Do you think there is an answer, or is it chance?
Well, I think it may be. I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't realised that I'd eliminated the 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, sort of flashing them through my mind, there are various films that I could have included. I mean, I think Preminger's work in the 60s, for example, is very interesting in this respect. I mean, stuff like Advise and Consent, which was one of the films I actually thought of showing, and The Cardinal and Hurry Sundown. I mean, I think the elimination of the 60s is probably fortuitous. Because I had a list of about 40 films, many of which have fallen by the wayside. So I mean, I don't think that's particularly a comment on the 60s. It's a comment on the selection.
Since you mentioned there's a lot of fallen by the wayside, should I just take you up on that and ask if there are any films that you very particularly wanted for this season which were unavailable, which you'd like to comment on in terms of their interest in this context?
Yes. Let me see, what were they? Night of the Hunter was one that I wanted to show, which seems to me a quite extraordinary commentary, again by a gay filmmaker.
Yes.
On the destructive consequences of the traditional masculine role. And I think it would have been a particularly useful film to show because it's quite explicitly about the expulsion of this man from the narrative, and it ends with indeed with the construction of a new community from which all adult male figures have been excluded. So I very much wanted to show that. What else went? Fear Strikes Out. The Robert Mulligan, Anthony Perkins, which again I wanted to show as an example of a sort of very strong interest in 50s American cinema with male stars who are not masculine in the traditional sense. People like Dean and Anthony Perkins, whose films are all built round the kind of difficulty for the characters played by the actors of maintaining a traditional masculine image. And Fear Strikes Out, I think, is a beautiful example of that. Those are the two that stick in my mind. But we simply aren't prints, so we couldn't show them.
To go back to some of those that are in the season, just to ask you for specific comments on perhaps sort of three of the films. A lot of the titles are well known, but one that is really quite a rarity, and I've certainly never come across it, is He Who Gets Slapped, which is an example of silent cinema.
Yes.
So would you like to say something about that?
Well, I think Lon Chaney is one of the most fascinating male stars. I think it's often been mentioned the kind of element of masochism in his work, and all his films are in various ways about men who have been disempowered. He plays cripples, hunchbacks, people who are, symbolically castrated, often, physically, who do not physically correspond to any dominant ideal of masculine potency. I think he's the only male star in the cinema of whom that is true, with the possible exception of Lawton. Lawton moves into that territory sometimes. And yet at the same time he frequently plays characters who, because they are perceived by the culture as not being properly male, then react to the suppression violently, aggressively, destructively. So I think what he's about as a star is precisely the kind of the fragility of conventional masculinity. He always plays characters for whom masculinity is a problem, or for whom it is not available, and who are then faced with the problem of kind of negotiating that. And I think He Who Gets Slapped is a very clear example, in that it takes the traditional image of the clown, which is regularly used as a symbol, as a kind of inverse symbol of male power anyway. So I chose it basically for that reason, and I think it's probably the most explicit.
Right, fine. Another one I was going to mention, because I don't know if I should be writing anything for capital K or not, but if I do, obviously it's a good idea to stress the gay aspects that come up here.
Yeah.
And I'm sure lots of gay people, purely as sort of escapism and as a kind of camp, enjoy the sort of Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movies and so on. But
yes.
On Top Hat, you actually say it contains more gay jokes per foot than any other Hollywood movie. So say something about that, and how conscious you think it was or wasn't.
Oh, I think it's extremely conscious. And it recurs repeatedly in relation to all the central male characters in the film. I mean, the plot requires that Fred Astaire and Edward Everett Horton should share the bridal suite in the hotel in Venice. And there are repeated jokes about this, which are sort of very explicitly gay jokes. There are a whole other set of jokes about Edward Everett Horton's relationship with Eric Blore, who's his butler. And another set about the Italian couturier Bedini, with whom Ginger Rogers is involved at the beginning of the film. So in fact all the four principal male characters are continually implicated in a set of jokes about masculinity.
And who decided to do this, and for what purpose? I mean, were they sort of in-jokes for a certain audience to pick up that other people wouldn't notice, or what do you feel?
Well, I think it's part of the. What the film is about is what it wants to do is to use Astaire and Rogers to create an image of the ideal couple, the ideal heterosexual couple, and it approaches that by surrounding them with various images of the couple which are not ideal, and part of the problem that the film has with traditional ideals of the couple is with excessively rigid definitions of maleness, and it's it is continually attacking machismo or excessive masculinity through gay jokes. I mean, I think the jokes are very positive. I mean, they're not anti-gay jokes.
Right.
They are. The film is very positive about them, and it's using them to deflate absurd male assumptions of superiority and power in a very progressive way, I think.
Right. The third of these films I had in mind to mention individually, because it struck me as a very good example of if certain readers are going to be sceptical, as I said I was initially on this, a good one where people would say, for heaven's sake, it's just a comedy and I sort of fell about and that's the end of the story,
yes.
is Bringing Up Baby, the end of patriarchal sexuality.
Yes.
So what would you say to people to persuade them in that case that there is an actual comment on that being made?
Well, I think really you only have to pay attention to the details of the film. The Cary Grant character is set up as this extremely inhibited, extremely respectable middle-class professional who is about to get married, and who is engaged in this rather sterile task of reconstructing the skeleton of a dinosaur. And in the early scenes of the film, it's suggested in various ways that he's less than happy about the idea of the approaching marriage, and particularly unhappy on sexual grounds. He immediately meets Katharine Hepburn on a golf course, who proceeds to destroy his life. She interrupts his marriage, she prevents him from meeting his girlfriend, she prevents him from meeting lots of very important professional contacts. And what the film suggests all the way through, which the Cary Grant character finally admits in the final scene, is that he enjoys this. The Katharine Hepburn character is apparently destroying his life, but he derives pleasure from it. And what I think the film is about is, the pleasure for a man of finally being forced into a position in which he has to give up the things which men are traditionally supposed to be. And there's one particularly striking scene where, he's taken to Katharine Hepburn's house in Connecticut, and eventually finds himself without any clothes, and puts on a negligee, one of Katharine Hepburn's negligees, and answers the door for an extremely respectable New England woman who's come to visit the family. And she says, "Why are you dressed like that?" And he says, "Well, I went gay suddenly." And again, this is not presented at all demeaningly. I mean, his feminization, if you like, his loss of masculinity, his loss of dignity, his loss of power, are all presented as positive things. And
word gay there is just chance.
Oh no,
is it or not?
No.
Because how far back does this word go? And it's having a sexual connotation.
As far as I'm aware, it's the first authenticated case in a movie where gay means homosexual.
And your evidence for that one is?
Well, I mean, Hawkes admits to it.
Again, in an interview, he said so, has he?
Yes.
That it was deliberately
yes.
so.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right.
I mean, I think it's again not. We're showing two Hawkes films. I think it's the only case of a director where we're showing two films. I think when one looks at Hawkes's comedies and places them all together, what you see is a quite a recurrent pattern. That what he's really interested in is refusing the dominant norms of being a man and being a woman, and arriving at relationships in which masculinity and femininity are kind of much freer.
Well, You Can't Sleep Here is obviously a case in point.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah.
And do you think the involvement of Cary Grant is relevant, an actor who I don't know if it's generally said always that he's gay now, but certainly one has heard it suggested of him at the very least?
I think it's crucial, yes. Presumably it was known to Hawks. And I think it's interesting that Hawks repeatedly uses gay men in his comedies. Rock Hudson is in Man's Favourite Sport. Cary Grant is in 3 or 4. Charles Farrell appears in one of the silent ones. I think there's something to that.
Right. Well, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground on that, getting towards the end of the tape. So certainly more than I need just for what's on, but I think it'll give me quite a lot of extra coverage if I have a chance to do something for Capital K as well.
Yeah.
Is there anything I haven't touched on in the season that you would particularly like to say yourself?
I don't think so. I think that covers most of the ground.
Right. Well, shall I just end then by making one other observation on a film we haven't mentioned, and that's The Shining, which you put forward as Jack Nicholson's most concentrated and least indulgent performance. You have to be joking.
Well, I normally can't stand Jack Nicholson. I think it's almost the only case where the excessiveness is justified by the context created by the film. What I usually feel about Nicholson is that the excessiveness is simply meaningless. It's a kind of personal flamboyance which makes no actual contribution to the film's meaning, and which isn't justified by anything else that the film does. Whereas I think in The Shining, perhaps because he's working with a director of that stature, the excessiveness is actually functional. I don't mean that it isn't an excessive performance. I just mean that it seems to be doing something,
right,
in a way which it doesn't in Superman, where he's just a kind of ham going over the top.
Right.
So that's what I mean by that comment.
Okay, fair enough. Good. Well, I think, as I say, that's covered a lot of ground, so thanks very much. I'll stop it there.